Morning and welcome to the 21st meeting in 2019 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Can I remind members to do the usual with their mobile phones, please. The first item on the agenda this morning is to decide to take item 3 in private. Are members agreed? Members are agreed. Thank you. Our next piece of business is to take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Economy and Fair Work on the Scottish Government's Fiscal Framework Outturn Report and other issues related to our pre-budget scrutiny. The Cabinet Secretary is accompanied today by Scottish Government officials, Lucia Carroll from the Director of Tax and Daniel Heinz, the Deputy Director of Fiscal Sustainability. I think we're just going to go straight to questions this morning, Cabinet Secretary. So for this session on the Fiscal Framework Outturn Report, it's part of our pre-budget scrutiny. Can I therefore start by reminding you that in its report in 2018-19, the audit of the Scottish Consolidated Accounts, the Auditor General for Scotland said, the Scottish Government needs to improve the quality of financial reporting to better support Parliament, citing concerns with the content of the medium-term financial strategy. How would the Scottish Government plan to respond to these comments?
I understand the concerns, Convener, but bearing in mind the UK Government's decision to set a one-year budget and not have that comprehensive spending review, it's made it more difficult for the Scottish Government to do the same. In terms of the position from the Auditor General, I believe there'll be much more information coming through the budget and the spending decisions that we make ourselves. I'll give further consideration to what the Auditor General has said around future medium-term financial strategy, but I think with the levels of volatility that we have, I'll be able to set out more in the budget itself. But within the MTFS, I think there was more information around scenarios and some of the principles that we would be deploying around fiscal policy as well, and set out a position on capital and other matters. But of course, I'll continue to consider fully the contents of the Auditor General's comments.
Okay. Murdo.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I wanted to ask you a question around the Barnett consequentials from the UK spending round. The figures we have suggest that these would amount to 1.1 billion of resource in terms of Barnett consequentials and 87.8 million in terms of capital applying to the financial year 2020 to 21. There also have been a number of announcements at the Conservative Party conference in the last couple of days, which may well lead to Barnett consequentials, and no doubt we'll hear more about that in the coming days. And you're starting for next year's budget with a point where there is a negative reconciliation due to the shortfall in income tax receipts compared to a forecast of 204 million. So your black hole for next year has already been filled in by the Barnett consequentials, and there are substantial additional monies at your disposal. And I was wondering if you're able to give us any flavour at the moment of how you might want to spend this extra money. We have councils across Scotland currently considering their budget position looking towards next year. At the same time, there's clearly pressure in terms of the health and education. Is there anything you can tell the committee about your thinking in terms of allocating this money?
I wouldn't want to prejudice the budget itself and then pre-allocate resources that are appropriate for the next financial year. So I don't want to I know this is pre-budget scrutiny. I look forward to the committee and other committees' recommendations and views around the budget. So I don't at this point propose to prejudice the budget, either presentation of it or any content of it either. So those consequentials will be part of the usual process in allocating those. In terms of some of the other matters raised within that, I think the Chancellor has been making some spending announcements over the course of his party conference. Of course, I look forward to the detail of that in terms of profile and Barnett consequentials coming to Scotland in detail, because there is an issue about how that's profiled as well. But any Barnett consequentials will be considered as part of the usual budget process. In terms of tax reconciliations, of course, that is covered in the outturn report itself for the next financial year, and we do have the ability to use the drawdown from the reserve and the reserve borrowing powers if we choose to use them. I set out some principles in the medium-term financial strategy, but the exact mechanisms that we use will be set out very clearly in the budget when it's presented. I might, if the committee wishes, say a word about the timescale for the budget as anticipated, as there's no clarity yet from the UK government on when their autumn budget will be. That leaves us in a position of not knowing the tax position and the whole envelope, the whole position for the Scottish budget, because of course in understanding the fiscal framework we need our tax determinations and the block grant adjustment determinations to fully inform the Scottish budget as well. It's my thinking right now that, as has been the pattern over the last few years, to set the Scottish budget in December. I'd propose the 12th of December, but that is, on the basis that we have a UK budget, and that would give me the necessary time to inform the Fiscal Commission, of course yourself, Convener's Finance Committee, and that's my current thinking, and that's the first time that that's been shared publicly, that's the date I work to. I'll write to committee to confirm that. But of course, we really do need that UK budget to help us with the figures that then drives the whole budget process. So that rhythm of business, that pattern, that timetable is, I think, now well established in the Parliament and with the committee. That's what I'll try and work to. But of course, that's made immeasurably more difficult if there's no UK budget in advance of that timescale. And we'd need to reflect very closely if there was no UK budget. And I'm not particularly clear from the Chancellor, Chief Secretary of the Treasury, as yet whether there will be a UK budget before the 31st of October or after, or where the potential of a UK general election may fit within that timescale as well. But I want to give this committee as much notice as possible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. You talked about the UK budget. I mean, there has been some suggestion that the Chancellor might announce further tax cuts in the UK budget, which potentially would create a larger tax differential between income tax rates in the rest of the UK and in Scotland, if that were to be the case, if you do not then shift your own tax policy. Is it your view that Scottish income tax receipts can bear a larger tax differential, or do you think we might get to the point where a growing tax differential in income tax becomes self-defeating and you actually end up raising less revenue by growing the tax gap?
Of course, the purpose of having the revenue-raising powers is to raise revenue. I'd want policies that achieve that optimal position that I set out when I set out the principles of the use of Scotland's income tax powers in relation to the Scottish budget. And that is to raise necessary revenue to invest in our public services, but it's also to deliver a more progressive system as well, to protect lower income earners and, crucially, to protect the economy. So I have said in debates, and maybe this point has sometimes been lost in the robust nature of our parliamentary discourse, but of course there's a point of divergence that runs the risk of not raising the money that we would wish, and I've made that point particularly around the top rate of tax. So I want to understand what that could be described as, what that tipping point of divergence is, to achieve those four principles of progressivity, of raising the necessary revenues to invest in our public services, but to protect the economy. And the premise of the question is, within that, what is the acceptable level of any potential divergence whilst protecting lower earners as well. So that's the four tests that I would apply. I've said I would use the Council of Economic Advisers to inform that decision. I'm actually engaging with business as well directly, both business representative organisations and employers directly, businesses directly, to understand is the tax regime in terms of income tax or even business tax an issue. So I'll take an evidence-based approach to understand what that is. But again, Murdo Fraser will understand that I can only respond in terms of Scotland's tax proposition, knowing what the UK's tax proposition is, because that then drives the figures in the fiscal framework and that relative tax that might be derived from any further policy divergence. But I do believe in a more progressive income tax system. The commitments that the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has made, I am advised, might not necessarily, what he said in the campaign, might not necessarily translate into government policy, but the budget will tell all in terms of that tax proposition, and we'll respond as a government accordingly, and Parliament can decide whether it supports that tax proposition. One other thing I would like to draw attention to, Convener, is it's again, the budget process goes through the negotiation and determination in Parliament, but we must pass a rate resolution for the budget to be complete. And if no rate resolution is passed, no income tax would be raised in Scotland, and that, of course, would have a massive effect on financing the public services of Scotland. But I'll take any decision around the tax rates with those four principles in mind.
Okay, thank you.
John, do you want to cover this area as well?
Just to come in, especially about this 1.1 billion that was mentioned, I mean, you've said yourself that some figures kind of get thrown around and are more suggestions than promises. I mean, is this 1.1 billion in consequentials absolutely solid? Is it set in stone? Would it survive a change to a different Conservative government? Would it survive a change to a completely different government?
So the point I think I made at the spending review itself is these numbers can't be guaranteed until a UK budget is set, because that will determine the figures. I'm going on the spending review figures as announced for 1 year by the UK government, but they will have to get such a budget through the Westminster Parliament in the usual fashion. But of course, the overall envelope for Scotland is also determined by the fiscal framework, their tax policies, the block grant adjustment, and of course the reconciliation within that. So it's not the whole story, and it is still subject to a UK budget, which is why the timing and then determinations of the UK budget is significant. And of course, the substantial part of those consequentials is the resource specifically to the NHS, which of course Scottish Government policy is to pass on those resource Barnett consequentials to health.
Yeah, because in the past sometimes there's been doubt as to whether is it new money that's being announced, or is some of it in fact money that's already been announced that they're just kind of restating. So is that a risk in here as well?
Well, again, we see the detail of a Barnett consequentials in terms of how it's proposed to be allocated to Scotland. That's notwithstanding the financial and the fiscal disputes that we have with the UK government. But it is based on their Barnettised spending. But as I say, all those other factors come into play to tell us exactly how much resource we'll have in the block grant overall. But it will still be subject to a UK budget as the basic premise of the question as to what will actually flow to Scotland.
And is the worst scenario that the Westminster goes back to March again for their budget, as they used to do, and then we're really in a difficult position?
That would be an incredibly difficult position, of course, because the Scottish Parliament's own processes will have been expected to have been concluded by them in terms of the budget over January and February. Local government would want their settlement numbers, all parts of the public sector would want their figures. So, of course, that would be maximum turbulence. We've not even spoken about Brexit yet, but that would be maximum turbulence to the parliamentary timetable that we've now established and would want to try and honour. I suppose I'm just hoping that a responsible UK government will deliver a UK budget sooner rather than later to give everyone in the UK some certainty. And certainly the devolved administrations have made the point about how critical it is to have awareness of the timing for the UK budget.
Thank you.
Now, I know you want to ask questions at VAT. I'll come back to that, John. But on the spending side, Patrick, of this equation, spending, Patrick has some questions as well. So.
Thanks. Yeah. Good morning. Just to follow up on this tax and spend, could I just clarify one point that you were discussing with Murdo Fraser on the tax side before I asked about spending? You seemed in answering Murdo Fraser's questions to accept one of the assumptions that was embedded in it that I think isn't quite right. Clearly, if the UK government chose to cut tax for the highest income people who need the least help, that would be the UK government choosing to create a bigger tax differential. But they might choose to reduce income tax for low earners who at the moment pay more tax south of the border than they do here. So that would be a tax cut the UK could choose to make that would actually reduce the tax differential. Is that not accurate?
That would be a view that I support and understand. That just doesn't happen to be the proposition, of course, from Boris Johnson, who's proposing in his campaign to cut tax, personal tax, income tax for the richest in society, and that is not a position that the Scottish Government or this Parliament, and including the Greens, has absolutely mirrored, because we believe in a more progressive tax system. I suppose the point I was making, I wasn't accepting Murdo Fraser's premise. I was simply setting out the 4 principles that I would deploy, which does understand the sensitivity that we want to set tax rates that achieve all 4 objectives, one of which is to raise the necessary revenue. And there is a point based on evidence that has the potential of raising less revenue rather than more because of potential tax divergence. I understand that point. I was trying to deliver a more progressive system.
I wasn't suggesting that a sensible progressive tax policy seems likely to come from Boris Johnson's government, only that in principle those decisions are UK government decisions, and if there's a bigger tax differential as a result of UK decisions, that's a matter for them. We should be comparing tax in this country with what we think it should be in a better, fairer Scotland, rather than with what it should be down south.
Absolutely, and that's why I set out principles including a more progressive system, raising the necessary revenue to invest in our public services, and if I can say so, Convener, that has been my track record to date, to deliver a more progressive system, but also be sensitive to the issues that would affect Scotland's economy as well. I have also said that I believe that we've got a pretty settled structure in relation to income tax in Scotland as well, having moved to that 5-band system.
Okay, just to move on to the spending side then, albeit you're not in a position to disclose what's going to be in the budget when you publish it, we all understand that, and you know, we're still in some degree of uncertainty, but if there is a real terms increase as a result of the Barnett consequentials offset against the reconciliation, if the overall effect of that is a real terms increase, there'll be, albeit it's unlikely to reverse 10 years plus of austerity, there'll be a lot of interest in where that's going to go. I think you should be in a position now to answer questions about the process you're going through at the moment, pre-budget, to arrive at that. For example, last year, you made a commitment that prior to the budget this year, there would be a process of discussion with local government about the construction of a 3-year settlement for local government. Is that process already underway? And can you tell us whether progress is being made toward that objective that is an existing Scottish Government commitment?
The discussions with local government have begun. Just yesterday we had a discussion with the Deputy First Minister, which was themed in education. There will be a discussion themed on health and social care. I'll meet regularly with local government, as I normally do, incidentally, in the construction of the budget, and have ongoing dialogue with them. And I intend to work with local government to give them illustrative numbers going forward, if that's clearly what they desire. I know the position we took with the negotiation with the Greens about a multi-year settlement with local government, but as I say, it's very difficult for me to set out clear numbers for a multi-year spending review when the UK government has cancelled that multi-year spending review, and therefore I will be able to produce that 1-year budget and then engage with local government around future years as illustrative figures, but it can't be a multi-year settlement because I won't have future years figures from the UK government, but I'll continue to meet with local government regularly.
You didn't have future years figures from the UK government when you made the commitment to a multi-year settlement for local government. Are you saying that commitment is no longer extant?
No, I can give local government future years, but they will also understand that it can't be concrete numbers because the UK government has cancelled their spending review that they were proposing to undertake, which they've now cancelled. And if they don't have a multi-year spending review, and I know I said this at Finance Committee when we were trying to undertake a multi-year spending review, that would be incredibly difficult to do if the UK government didn't conduct a spending review as well, because it drives so many of our numbers.
I appreciate that. I would make the comparison with the Scottish Government's existing manifesto commitment for multi-year, in fact, the full length of the Parliament, increases in real terms for the NHS, something I'm sure we would all support, but it shows that it is possible to make that kind of long-term commitment in the absence of long-term funding from the UK government.
I think that's a fair point, and there are elements of the budget that have been determined on a multi-year basis, but that will include component parts, such as investment into early learning and childcare, such as investment into housing as well. I think there are good examples where we have made a multi-year commitment. Digital is, I think, another example. I'm simply making the point that I know this is pre-budget scrutiny, and I still wish to give local government multi-year numbers, but they, I think, would accept that if the UK government has cancelled the spending review that drives, you know, the largest share of our total block, then it's very difficult to set out concrete numbers for future years. And again, that's even before we get into the volatility of the additional elements of the fiscal framework or what the economy may face as a consequence of Brexit. But I'll engage constructively with local government, and of course I'll work to honour the deals we've made through budget negotiations. But I'm just being very clear, if Parliament expects me to set multi-year budgets with that level of unknown and volatility, it'd be very difficult, and I'm not sure the numbers would be credible, but I'll be as constructive as I can to set out those multi-year numbers.
I understand the point you're making. Just one final point. Again, this is just simply to clarify whether previously stated Scottish Government positions about its long-term goals in terms of budgeting remain the position. You previously said when you ended the public sector pay cap that this was the beginning of a journey to restoration of the value of public sector pay. So I'd like to ask if that remains the position. It's also been said that the entire capital budget is under review in light of the statements from the First Minister about the climate emergency. So in looking at your capital budget, what processes are currently being undertaken to review existing capital projects in light of that statement?
Okay, in terms of multi-year, I mean, it's still the position of the Scottish Government. We see the benefit in multi-year budgeting. Of course we do in those comprehensive spending reviews. It's the UK Government, for whatever reason, I won't get into the politics, but for whatever reason, have moved away from a multi-year spending review into a one-year spending review, and therefore a one-year budget that then drives the numbers. But as a matter of policy, of course, we still aspire to multi-year spending reviews, and we still want to undertake the budget process through the prism of our outcomes focus, which does include the net zero emissions agenda, child poverty and well-being, and that outcomes focus as well. On the issue around capital specifically, I propose to set out essentially the one-year capital budget, but because we're going to be advised by the Infrastructure Commission and we're reviewing the infrastructure pipeline, and of course having set out as a primary mission for the Scottish National Investment Bank around those interventions, around our journey to net zero, then clearly our budgets will have to reflect that, including capital. So there is a review of capital to make sure it aligns with that policy priority and the climate emergency that the First Minister has declared. So I'll propose a one-year capital budget, and we'll do those further capital decisions by midsummer. I think I set that out in the medium-term financial strategy in terms of that capital approach, but it will reflect the climate emergency. Absolutely will feature in our capital plans.
Thank you.
Alec Rowley.
Yeah, could I come to maybe a couple of questions? Can I ask first, I think it was your budget last year where, page 11, you said that each spending department would be asked to make savings of 3% and report back to Parliament on those efficiency savings. How's that going?
Well, essentially, efficiency savings are reinvested. The budget, as approved by Parliament, was set out and ultimately approved, and portfolios make savings as well as the allocations that they receive. Now, I have to say that the finances will continue to be challenging. I think to an earlier point that John Mason said that even the Barnett consequentials will not make up for the 10 years of austerity that we've faced, and therefore it will still be challenging going forward, even with the Barnett consequentials that have been announced so far. But we'll expect portfolios in all parts of the public sector to continue to show efficiencies as we deliver our frontline public services.
Yeah, it was just that there was that specific statement in your budget that actually said efficiency savings would be made, reports would be made to Parliament, and I haven't seen any of that happen, so I just assumed that didn't happen. And the reason I'm linking that is that I was looking there, but I can't seem to find it, but you seem to have increased the reserves, and I just wondered if there was any relationship between efficiency savings and the amount of reserves that you've increased.
No, the reserves, as reported, reflect the fact, and I've covered reserves in statements to Parliament, and essentially efficiency savings are reinvested. Reserves can arise from tax receipts or underspend or late Barnett consequentials, and I think I've set out what the reserve position is. It's actually far smaller than what's often reported in the public domain. I'm happy to check the efficiency reports, and if there's more information I can share with committee, then I certainly will.
Okay, could I also then, on spending specifically on these Barnett consequentials, it also mentions there that there would be an additional 87.8 million in capital. Could I then focus in on, just for clarity, in terms of education spend, have you shifted the methodology in terms of capital spend for education? Because I seem to be picking up for local authorities that there is a shift of methodology in terms of capital, where you seem to be going to pay them revenue and they'll do the borrowing.
So specifically on capital, in the last budget, local government had an uplift in capital. Some of that was specific purposes. £150 million was paying back to local authorities. Essentially what was borrowed from local authorities, that was an agreement reached with local governments, so 150 million went back. There's £50 million for the town centre fund. And then, as I say, there was a traditional support and CDL capital capacity to local government. There's been a further funding announcement by the Deputy First Minister on how we can fund the future learning estate, and it requires a contribution from local government. That would hardly be surprising, knowing that the school estate is a statutory and primary function of local authorities, but the Scottish Government, in continuing this journey of massively improving the quality of our estate into good and satisfactory condition of school buildings, there is a funding model available, and it also takes into account some of the rules around borrowing and the hub model. So there is a new financing tool for funding school improvement, but it's largely been welcomed by local government because it represents extra finance to support that journey of school refurbishment and renewal. And again, I'm happy to give the committee more information on the specifics of that. But it's not to the detriment of local government. It's in addition to the capital that local government might choose to spend on its school estate programme.
I would welcome additional information on that. And finally, just on this part, in terms of the spend, the accountants say here that if this Barnett consequentials was going on health, it would be 635 million, 324 million on education. Can I ask, and it's this question of transparency. I keep picking up that a lot of people find it difficult to see where the transparency of spending is on health and social care, because you seem to have money that goes into local government, there's money that goes into NHS boards, and then even the people on the joint health and social care boards seem to have difficulty trying to work out. So do you accept that certainly there's a perception that there's a transparency issue around funding for health and social care, and is that something that you're willing to address in the budget? From a point of view, would it not be easier to have some kind of ring-fence budget so people were able to see very clearly what's been spent on health and social care, given it's one of the areas that will demand growth at an accelerated pace, given the demographics that we have in Scotland?
I think it's one of the first times that Alec Rowley particularly has argued for a substantial ring-fenced budget, but I understand the reason for the question. I wouldn't say it lacks transparency, but I would say it's complex. And it's complex because of the nature of health and social care integration. I think it's a journey that's well received, and I think it's really important that the resources are being targeted to those in greatest need. And where in the past there has been that debate and conflict between social care and health, we're trying to bring that together. But it is true to say that sometimes that money has been routed through health and other times through local government, partly because local government's been expressing the pressure on their social care budgets, partly because health is a responsibility here as well. But the premise to the question, is there a better way of doing it? I think there probably is, but I think that's a discussion we should have in partnership with local government and with health to align those resources to achieve the integration in its fullest sense. So to the question, am I willing to address this and look at it? Yes, I am. But I think there's a complexity as part of that in understanding where the different funds are and bringing it together. But I think that's a reason to continue our integration journey, because the most important thing here is that the resources should reach those in need and the system should respond to that demand. And that's partly how we've been able to allocate resources essentially to health and to that health and social care agenda, because they're inextricably linked between those people, say, in a hospital ward that should be in the community. So we've got to make the resources available, but do it in partnership between local government, health and the IGBs.
Right. In that exchange, the issue of reserves emerged. And Gordon, I think you had questions around reserves and forecasting. So.
Yeah, thanks very much, Convener. I was wanting to ask about the forecast errors. The vast majority of organisations have to deal with one set of forecasts, but in setting the Scottish budget, you've obviously got sometimes different forecasts from both the OBR and the Scottish Fiscal Commission. I'm just wondering what kind of difficulties and uncertainties that creates.
Well, I think the difficulties and the uncertainties are now self-evident in the reconciliation numbers that are emerging and the new advice that we are receiving since the fiscal framework, of course, was first agreed, because those reconciliation numbers are substantial, more potentially for 2021-22. To address 2020-21's reconciliation numbers, I mean, that could be dealt with within the reserve drawdown and the borrowing capacity, not so 2021-22. Now, that is driven by, of course, the SFC and the OBR numbers, and that is an issue that we have rehearsed regularly within this committee about, and you have taken evidence on this from the SFC and the OBR, and the application of it through HMRC as well. But essentially there is an immense difficulty on working on two sets of forecasts where the methodology for both are different. That then drives the drawdown number for our budget that we use to determine a budget, and then of course have to reconcile once the numbers are finalised, which the outturn report now speaks to. So it is complex, it is volatile, it will be difficult to manage with the range of potential error. And again, this is nothing to do with economic performance. This is forecast error issues we're discussing here based on what the economists find. And that level of volatility is a concern, Convener. So much so I have raised it with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. I was asked yesterday at Economy Committee about our borrowing capacity, and it was more so, it was a question from Jackie Bailey in relation to particularly economic volatility and Brexit. But of course here, just on tax reconciliation, the current figures go beyond our drawdown limit and our reserve borrowing capacity, and that therefore is a concern to me, to any finance secretary, and that's why I've asked the UK government to consider the parameters around the fiscal framework and our borrowing limits, so that we have more tools to smooth that and respond to that. And for those reasons, I do believe it is a concern, and that's why I've raised the issue with Treasury. Convener, I'm happy to share that letter that I wrote to the Chief Secretary subsequent to the meeting that I had with the Chief Secretary with the committee.
You touched upon the 200 million for next year's 2021 budget. The suggestion is it could be as high as 608 million the following year. the evidence that this committee heard from the Fiscal Commission was that OBR's track record on forecasting had an average absolute error of 3.3%, which equates to roughly 500 million per annum. So, you know, you could be facing large adjustments year on year for the next few years. Do you believe that the fiscal framework's fit for purpose?
I think that was the point that I was trying to express. I mean, I think the framework as a set of principles was fine, but with the rolling out of that volatility, those forecast errors, I mean, that level of forecast error that we're now being advised might be a regular occurrence of over £600 million, of course, is a concern, because if you take the reserve borrowing limit and the maximum, even if we had reserves stored away, the maximum we could draw down could not accommodate that every year. 1 year's difficult, but for that occurrence, even though the SFC has said a row of negative reconciliations might then be followed by a row of positive reconciliations, isn't much comfort when you're facing the negative reconciliations. And for those reasons, I do think that the reserve borrowing capacity should be reviewed as a matter of urgency because of that new evidence, because of that reality, just because of forecast error. That is a concern, and that's why I've raised it, and that's why I do believe it needs to be reviewed.
Okay, thanks very much.
Alexander Burnett, you think landfill issues?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, just around the landfill tax issue. I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary takes no joy in the probably rather unique area where the failures elsewhere in government have produced this additional revenue for his budget. But I was wondering, is there a case for spending this windfall directly on addressing the problem of landfill? And secondly, given the Cabinet Secretary of Environment has talked about missing now the landfill ban, what confidence he has in these in the rest of the forecast figures going forward?
Well, I know that Alexander Burnett has chosen to use some slightly pejorative language there, blaming Scottish Government here, when actually most waste collection and policies decided by local government, landfill operators and waste companies as well. So let's all take responsibility for the fact that we should be working together to deal with waste and have as little going to landfill as possible. Now, the Environment Secretary can speak to the decisions around relaxation on this issue, but of course we're very focused on trying to reduce the amount of waste going to landfill. Of course, there's a fiscal benefit if it goes, I suppose, because more landfill tax is raised, and we wanted less landfill tax to be raised because, of course, it is the case that what that represents is more waste going to landfill. But when some local authorities and operators expressed the issue and the risk that we could create waste tourism, i.e. it would be sent south of the border, of course on vehicles to take it south of the border, we had to respond in a pragmatic fashion. It's not about allocating blame, but for that reason there is, I suppose, that a potential of increased tax. I mean, let's see, again, this is another relative tax. Let's see what happens in terms of the block grant adjustment, what happens in England as well in terms of that waste issue. I am loath generally, though, to hypothecate funds for taxation in the same way that I'm loath to just photocopy a Chancellor's budget when we have different principles and a different approach. So we will clearly be allocating resources to our environmental agenda towards the climate challenge as well, but I'm loath to hypothecate particular funds. I mean, I think it's fair to say the fiscal framework is complex enough without adding another layer of complexity about hypothecating funds into the future, knowing what we know. But while we have that focus and investment to achieve the future targets around waste, yes, we will.
Yeah, thank you. I think we all agree that addressing landfill is an issue that we should all be working at whatever level it is. But just the second part of the question, I don't think you really answered, was how accurate do you think these revenue figures are for landfill tax, given what the Cabinet Secretary of Environment said?
Well, I mean, economists have given a view on how accurate the figures are. The figures, now, if memory serves me correctly, the forecast would have been made before the change in policy from the Environment Secretary, so I fully expect the figures to be reviewed in light of that.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, you yourself raised the issue of Brexit a couple of times. I think, Tom, you had questions in that area.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. 4 weeks tomorrow, the UK is scheduled to leave the European Union, and the latest dispatches to emerge overnight suggest that the prospects of a deal being reached by that point are remote. And while there is the Benn Act in place, we cannot rule out some procedural jiggery-pokery rendering it null and void. So the prospect of a no-deal Brexit on Halloween is a very real one. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what the impact of a no-deal Brexit would be on your assumptions and budget planning?
So as I expressed earlier, right now I don't know when the UK budget is going to be. I don't know if the UK government knows when the UK budget is going to be. I don't think they fully know the content of that. I've seen rhetoric in public realm about the Chancellor talking about using having an economic response. I can only envisage that what he means by that is he understands the economic consensus is that if there's a no-deal Brexit, we will be entering a recession, there will be business failure, there will be soaring unemployment, communities and the most disadvantaged in communities will be affected. There will be impacts, of course, in transport and supply and demand, and there'll be that contraction in the economy, I think, will be severe, and the exports will be affected. All of that in itself, of course, is a negative economic consequence and would feed into the fiscal decisions that the UK government and Scottish government would have to make. Now, we have allocated and committed the Brexit consequentials that we have received, but the information I have today is the cost of Brexit, both to the Scottish Government and our agencies. So I've just covered the cost to the economy. The cost to the Scottish Government and agencies to execute our no-deal plan will not be covered by the UK Government. So it will mean choices within government as to how far we can go in terms of our contingency plans, or what else is reprioritised or indeed cut to be able to pay to help mitigate the impact of that no-deal Brexit, which I agree feels more likely, maybe more likely than ever, as a consequence of the Prime Minister and the UK Government's handling of the situation. So it will have a catastrophic effect on our economy, a very negative impact on the fiscal position of Scotland as well.
Have the UK Government been able to give you any indication of what their response would be, a fiscal response would be to a no-deal Brexit, to give you any steer on what to expect from them?
I think there's been very poor engagement for the most recent period from UK Government. They've had UK Government papers leaked, Yellowhammer and Kingfisher. We've had some engagement, but not satisfactory, and no clear indication of forward-looking fiscal policy that would assist us to make decisions on how to respond. We can't possibly mitigate the full impact of Brexit. I'm very clear about that, and UK Government should be more transparent about what their plans are.
And my final question is, notwithstanding the possibility of a no-deal, the fiscal framework is a product of the pre-Brexit world. What do you think the implications are for the fiscal framework review of the post-Brexit world we may be entering?
So I suppose I tried to cover in what we already knew about the fiscal framework, the information and the evidence that's unfolding, the levels of volatility and income tax reconciliations in particular, and of course there'll be social security pressures as well as they come into play in Scotland's budget. Added to that is the volatility of Brexit, which, as I say, I think render particularly the borrowing powers totally inadequate in the face of that economic catastrophe that will come as a consequence of a no-deal Brexit.
Okay.
Angela, is this the same area?
No.
Okay, I'll take you first, Henry. On you go.
All right, okay.
Then
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I want to explore the issue of income tax receipts in the context of wage growth. Both the Outturn report and the Fiscal Commission forecasts point to income tax receipts increasing every year. We know that income tax reconciliations have been due to faster wage growth in the rest of the UK, particularly amongst higher earners. Committee has heard evidence that achieving higher income tax revenues requires pay growth right across the distribution, and that pay growth at the top end of the distribution should not be at the expense of pay growth across the piece. So as well as being alive to the issues of inequality within Scotland, I wondered how if the Cabinet Secretary feels that there is a risk, an additional risk that Scotland loses out to increasing inequality elsewhere in the UK, and what, if anything, can we do to mitigate that?
I genuinely think there is a real risk here, and maybe that risk was unforeseen. Only as we get more data about what tax is actually collected in Scotland is that then fully understood, and the SFC has said they probably need further years to understand whether this is a structural issue, whether this is a cyclical issue. But it is also true to say that inequality in the rest of the UK is deepening as the top earners are earning more proportionately and earning more as a quantum as well. That's not so much a feature in Scotland because we have fewer top-rate taxpayers, and because of the income distribution in Scotland is different. I think there is a distribution issue there, and I think there is a structural issue there that was unforeseen. As that evidence unfolds, I think, again, there's a case for the UK government to reflect on that and say that's not in itself an issue about economic performance. That is an issue about increasing inequality within the UK, and therefore in Scotland, I think we have to look at the distribution we have in terms of income. I mean, of course, we want equality, greater equality, of course, in incomes and redistribution and employment, and bringing more people up through the living wage and all those other mechanisms. But the analysis is correct. We now see an issue emerging in terms of that. There has been specific issues that I've raised with UK government at the bottom end as well. So there was a spillover issue where the UK government, in raising the personal allowance, and of course that's those who are paid the least, again understanding that distribution issue, that we felt there was a case for UK government to consider that a spillover effect as well at those at the bottom of the income distribution, because by them raising the personal allowance, then essentially we've lost out as part of the fiscal framework. And then there's a range of policies to try and support wage growth within Scotland. But this is a very specific issue about those at the top being paid relatively more, which is a reflection of deepening inequality across the whole of the UK. We can do what we can in Scotland, but I don't think we can stem that deepening inequality that has now been experienced across the whole of the UK, which then, of course, has a material impact on our numbers.
John, you had questions on VAT?
Please, thank you very much. Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. I realise I was not on the committee, and there have been discussions between yourself and the committee previously about VAT and some of the challenges around that. But I wonder if you could just give us maybe an update as to where we are at the moment.
My understanding is I've raised the issue of VAT, my concerns around the methodology, but more so the volatility, particularly in the potential Brexit scenario. We'll be using a baseline, and that period of transition at potentially a most volatile point. No deal Brexit comes to pass, and it feels more likely that it may. We'll be dealing with that consumer confidence issue. We'll be dealing with the potential impacts of the recession, and at that point of maximum volatility, we could be taking on the position of VAT, which would add to the overall volatility of the Scottish budget. So I've expressed my concerns to Treasury. I've expressed it to the new Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Maybe he was hearing it for the first time from me direct. I think they're reflecting on it, but I'm advised there might be a letter coming from Treasury fairly imminently. Once I receive an update from Treasury, I can return to committee. But my position on wishing it to be deferred for those reasons hasn't changed.
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, as I understand it, one of the problems here is that with all the other taxes, landfill, land building transaction tax, income tax, at some point we're dealing with the real numbers. I mean, the actual numbers that Scottish people are paying income tax in Scotland. Is it part of the problem with VAT that we're kind of never dealing with the real numbers because they're just not recorded anywhere, and we're always going to be working on estimates? Is that part of the problem?
Well, that's correct, and that's part of the problem. But I'm also trying to be pragmatic and realistic as well, and to say, well, we could have a further negotiation on VAT, but give us the tools to help smooth the volatility. So Scottish Government will compromise here if we get a realistic proposition from Treasury, but it can't just be take the it's not a power, of course, it's only assignment based on estimates with no reconciliation and no final outturn figures at the maximum point of volatility, in addition to the other pressures we're facing, with a lack of tools to address that volatility. So I think, you know, we've worked really hard on the methodology of it. I don't know how much further we can go in estimates, but there would never be a complete finalised, yes, this is categorically what was raised in Scotland. I would try and compromise with Treasury if there was a further compromise around the levers to be able to address that volatility, especially in the context of what I've described earlier, and there was an understanding about the volatility we're facing right now, if that's of assistance.
No, I mean, that's helpful, because I think you're saying there's extra problems with because of Brexit and so on and so forth and the volatility, but there's also, it seems to me, a long-term problem as to how we actually do this. I mean, I'd hoped that if we, say, built a new factory here and, you know, that would add value, and that would be what I would have thought we were taxing, was that added value of what that factory produced. But as I understand it, that's not even on the table.
Yeah, I mean, Convener, this committee has discussed it as well, and I think shared some of the concerns. You wouldn't be the only one. Fraser of Allender Institute said a key aim of the Smith Commission was to improve accountability, make Scotland's politicians responsible for the money that they spend. Unfortunately, rather than helping to deliver this aim, the current proposals for VAT assignment risk undermining that principle. So I think the concerns around this are quite widely shared, but if UK Government can provide further solutions and remedies to those challenges, then we can engage further, and I'm advised a response to my request is imminent. I'll share that with committee as quickly as I can.
Murdo.
Thank you.
Thanks, Convener. Can I just follow up on John Mason's questions? Because you said something interesting about seeking additional levers to address this question of volatility around VAT assignment. By additional levers, are you talking about increased borrowing powers or something else?
Yes, resource borrowing powers, yes. Okay. I think that's a very helpful set of parameters. So if we look at the income tax reconciliation that I've discussed, if you look at the parameters that were agreed at the time, what we now know about the potential of negative income tax reconciliations could be as much as £600 million a year for a few years. Take into account the social security volatility, take into account the VAT volatility here, then I think it renders those current limits inadequate. So whilst I'll always say to UK Government, you know, give us a fairer settlement, give us our fair share of consequentials, what I'm actually saying here is give us more tools to do the job, to meet our responsibilities, to do it responsibly, and it feels that that borrowing capacity would be one good way to do it. But we have to have confidence in the methodology around VAT, so we're assured it's as close to what is actually raised in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK as possible.
Thank you, that's very helpful. And for the benefit of the committee, are you able to put a figure on that level of additional flexibility you're looking for? So
what I've raised so far was specifically around, and again I've said I'll share the letter with committee, around the income tax reconciliation. I haven't set a figure on VAT, and the reason for that is I genuinely want to discuss with Treasury what does a compromise look like. If they want us to take on assignment, it's not a power. I would actually quite like the power to set VAT because it would be a more helpful economic lever to pull in terms of responding to the economic challenges, specifically to Scotland, or policies that we might wish to make. It is only assignation. But I haven't got into figures around VAT. Discussions I've had so far have been primarily around income tax volatility and, of course, permissions around the Scottish National Investment Bank, where the committee will understand that the current constraints around that drawdown limit and the borrowing limits will inadvertently affect the bank as well, and that's why I've tried to engage with Treasury on that matter. I don't think the answer's no, so I'm continuing to engage as constructively as I can with Treasury.
Just very quickly, in terms of policy spillover issue and the personal limits, just for record's sake, Cabinet Secretary, in a letter to the committee on the 30th of May on that issue, the UK Treasury accepted that the above inflation increase to personal allowance had constituted a change to policy, and they were considering the Scottish Government's analysis of the issue. They also went on to say we will consider any transfer of funding is due for these years. if the Scottish Government and UK can agree the methodology approach. Where's that got to?
Well, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury has been moved on. I have a new Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and I think the new Chief Secretary to the Treasury is considering the information that we've presented to them. I don't have a conclusion with Treasury as yet. They're still considering the matter.
It's been going on some time now, though.
Indeed it has, and we have been pursuing Treasury. I was quite frustrated, I have to say, Convener, at my first face-to-face meeting with the Chief Secretary. In fairness, he was catching up with his brief. I think that was some 3 weeks in from appointment. I did make efforts to engage with him early on, but obviously we need progress in all of these matters. I accept the UK Government's incredibly busy right now, but we all are, but we need some satisfactory conclusion to these matters to give us certainty going forward, Convener.
Thank you. In that case, I thank the Cabinet Secretaries and officials for their evidence this morning. At the start of the meeting, we agreed to take the next item in private, so I now suspend this meeting to allow our witnesses to leave. Thank you very much.